Blackwood Ridge, Montana Territory, winter of 1888. The man kicked the door open, blood running down his neck, snow packed into his beard. He slammed both hands flat on the counter and looked straight at her. Marry me before sunrise. Evelyn didn't step back, didn't blink. I have a husband, she said, and you're bleeding. I know. His voice was flat as stone, but there's a 7-year-old child who loses everything at 6 o'clock this morning, unless you say yes. The kerosene lamp swayed. Snow curled in under the door. And Evelyn Mercer, a woman hiding under a borrowed name, looked at this stranger, then looked at the clock. 5 hours left. Stay with us, because nothing about this night goes the way either of them planned. The wind hit the front of Mercer's dry goods like a flat palm against glass. Evelyn Mercer, who went by Nora, here Nora Finch, had gone by Nora for 8 months now, was behind the counter tallying a column of numbers she already knew didn't add up. Outside, the gale had picked up something fierce. Snow was coming in under the door in little dry curls, settling on the floorboards and staying there. The kerosene lamp above her head swayed on its hook, threw orange light, then shadow, then orange again. She didn't look up when the bell above the door rang. She looked up when the door hit the wall. The man who came through wasn't walking so much as holding himself upright by sheer stubbornness. He was tall, broad, across the shoulders, in a way that made the door frame seem narrow, and he was bleeding. A dark stripe ran from just below his left ear down the side of his neck and disappeared into his collar. His sheepskin coat was open, despite the cold. Snow clung to his hat, his beard, his eyelashes. She knew who he was. Everyone in Blackwood Ridge knew Garrett Thorne. You did not know a man like that. You just hoped he had no reason to come looking for you. He kicked the door shut behind him. The lamp swung. He crossed the floor in 4 strides and put both hands flat on the counter, leaned forward. His eyes were gray-green, like river water in November, and they were looking at her in a way that meant he wasn't going to waste time on pleasantries. I need help, he said. Evie set down her pencil. You need a doctor. I need a wife. The lamp swayed. She didn't move. Excuse me? He reached up and pressed the back of his hand against the wound on his neck, pulled it away. Looked at the blood the way a man looks at rain, noting it, not particularly alarmed. Sterling served me papers tonight. Jared Sterling, county commissioner, he said. The name like it tasted rotten. He's going after my ranch. Water rights. There's a clause in the territorial charter that lets the county absorb property if there's no stable family occupying it. Evie folded her hands on the counter, said nothing, let him talk. My sister died 3 months ago. She had a daughter, Hattie, 7 years old. County took her before I could get there. Had her in the poorhouse since October. His jaw moved. I've been fighting the paperwork ever since. Sterling's been sitting on it, waiting. Tonight he came to tell me why. He paused. If I can't produce a legal marriage certificate by 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, before sunrise he uses the morality clause to classify my ranch as an unsuitable environment. Hattie goes into the county workhouse. The ranch goes to his people. Evie was quiet for a moment. And you came to me. You're the only unmarried woman in this county. I trust not to make things worse. She almost laughed at that, almost, Mr. Thorne. She kept her voice even. We have spoken twice. Once, when you bought a box of nails, and once when you told me my front step was rotting. Both times you looked me in the eye and didn't flinch, he said it, without sentiment, like a fact. That matters more than you think. She turned away from him, moved to the small shelf behind the counter, where she kept a tin of linen strips and a bottle of carbolic. She brought them around and set them in front of him without a word. He looked at them, then at her. Sit down, she said. Let me look at it. He sat on the edge of the supply crate, without argument. She unwound the linen, soaked the end with carbolic, and pressed it to the wound with 2 fingers. He didn't make a sound. The cut wasn't deep a graze. She decided something fast and close, a bullet that had nearly been something much worse. Sterling's men? She asked. One of them got brave on his way out. His voice was flat. I discouraged him. She wound the linen around his neck and knotted it, stepped back. I can't marry you, she said. I know. He didn't argue it. I'm not asking for a real one. I'm asking for a legal one, paper. A signature in front of Judge Ross. That's all. Come spring, if you want it dissolved. Ross will do it quiet. She turned back to her counter. The numbers in her ledger blurred for a second. 8 months of careful silence. 8 months of Nora Finch. Dry goods. Yes, sir, and no ma'am, and eyes down. 8 months of watching every face that came through the door for one she recognized. She turned around. There's something you need to know before I answer you, she said. My name isn't Nora Finch. He waited. It's Evelyn Mercer. I'm from Chicago. I have a husband, a legal one, though I haven't seen him in 8 months and, God willing, never will again. His name is Julian Montgomery. He sits on 2 federal advisory committees, and he has friends in law enforcement in 6 states. She kept her voice steady. She'd practiced this. He hurt me. Badly and often. I left in March with $40, a train ticket, and a different name. His people have been looking for me since April. She watched his face. Nothing shifted in it. Sterling came to see me last week, she continued. He doesn't know who I really am. Not yet. But he's suspicious. He threatened to hand me to the federal marshals on vagrancy charges if I didn't cooperate with some business he wanted me to sign off on. Falsified stock records. He wanted a woman's name on it, someone expendable. She looked at him. I said no. He said he'd make my life difficult. Garrett Thorne looked at the wound on his own neck, then back at her. So Sterling's got a blade at both our throats, he said. That's one way to put it. Then we've got the same problem and half a solution each. He stood up slowly. You marry me tonight, you're no longer a vagrant. You're a ranch wife. You're on record as Evelyn Thorne. Whatever name you were born with stops mattering to anybody who comes looking. You go up Blackwood Ridge with me. You disappear behind 3,000 feet of mountain and 6 feet of Montana winter. Nobody from Chicago gets up that road until spring. She stared at him. It was a cold calculation. She knew that. He knew she knew it. There was no romance in it. No warmth. No pretense of either. Just 2 people in a failing light, counting what they had left to trade. But then she thought about the child. She thought about a little girl stepping off a train. 7 years old, having spent October and November in a county poorhouse. She thought about what that looked like. What it did to a person, even a small one, especially a small one. She'd been a teacher once. In another life, with another name. She'd had 22 students in a 1-room schoolhouse in the 2nd Ward of Chicago. She knew what a child looked like before they learned to stop asking for help. She made her decision. I have one condition, she said. Name it, the child. Whatever happens between us, however, this ends that little girl comes first. Not the water rights, not the paperwork. She held his gaze. Something moved in his expression. Not much, but something. That was already the whole point, he said quietly. She nodded, moved around the counter, began pulling her coat from the hook near the back room door. There's something else, she said, her back to him. I want you to understand why I'm saying yes. It isn't because I'm cornered. It isn't only because I need protection. She turned around and looked at him straight. Silence in the face of cruelty is complicity. I'm going with you not for a contract, but for that little girl. He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp had stopped swinging. The snow kept coming under the door. All right, he said. She finished buttoning her coat, pulled her wool scarf from the peg. The ledger on the counter still had her wrong numbers in it. She left it there. Judge Ross, she said. Do you know where he's staying tonight? Miller's, boarding house, 3 blocks north. Then we'd better hurry. She picked up the small lamp from the end of the counter. How much time do we have? Garrett Thorne checked the watch in his coat pocket, snapped it shut. 5 hours, he said. Maybe less. She walked to the door and opened it. The wind came in hard and cold, hit her full in the face. She didn't step back from it. Then let's not waste them, she said. He followed her out into the dark. The door swung shut behind them. The lamp she carried bent its small flame sideways in the gale, but held. They moved up the empty street together. Two strangers, with a plan and no good options, walking towards something neither of them had a name for yet. Above Blackwood Ridge, the sky was solid black, and the snow was falling heavier now. Sunrise was still 5 hours away. The boarding house was dark except for one window on the second floor. Garrett knocked 3 times. Hard, the kind of knock that didn't apologize for the hour. Evie stood beside him on the porch, her lamp in one hand and her coat pulled tight with the other. The wind had dropped to a low moan. Snow was coming down steady and serious, now the kind that meant business. A shadow moved behind the curtain. A minute passed. Then the door opened, and Judge Thaddeus Ross stood in the frame in his nightshirt and suspenders, holding a lamp of his own and squinting at them both like he wasn't sure if he was still asleep. He was a compact man, Ross, short and square-shouldered, with a white mustache and small dark eyes that missed very little. He'd been riding the circuit for 22 years. He'd seen most things, his expression said. He hadn't seen this particular combination before. "Thorne," he said. "Judge." Garrett pulled his hat off. "I need a marriage performed tonight." Ross looked at Evie, then back at Garrett, then at the linen strip around Garrett's neck, which had soaked through on one side and gone a dark brownish red. "You'd better come in," he said. They sat at his small writing table while he listened. Garrett laid it out clean and fast. Sterling's ultimatum, the charter clause. Hattie arriving on the morning train, the 6 o'clock deadline. He didn't editorialize. He didn't ask for sympathy. He stated the situation like a man reading a dispatch. Ross listened with his hands folded on the table. When Garrett finished, the judge looked at Evie. "And you, miss?" "Mercer," she said. "Evelyn Mercer. I'm entering this marriage voluntarily and with full understanding of the circumstances." He studied her face. She held still under it. "You understand this is a legal instrument," he said, "not a performance." "I do. And you, Thorne, you understand the same." "Yes, sir." Ross was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table, then at the lamp, then at some point in the middle distance that neither of them could see. He was working something through. You could see it on him. Then he stood and went to his coat rack. "I'll need 2 witnesses," he said, pulling on his coat over the nightshirt. "Wake Miller and his wife. Tell them I sent you." Garrett was already at the door. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Miller's wife cried a little, which she seemed embarrassed about. Her husband signed the register with his tongue between his teeth and handed the pen to his wife like it was something delicate. Ross spoke the words without ceremony, but without rushing them either. His voice in the low-lit parlor was steady and unhurried, the same voice he used in a courtroom, the same weight. Garrett said, "I do looking straight ahead." Evie said, "I do looking at him." When it was done, Ross signed the certificate, blotted it, and held it out. Garrett took it and folded it into his inside coat pocket like it was a field order. "That's a legal marriage," Ross said. "See that you treat it like one." "Yes, sir," Garrett said. Evie thanked the Millers. She meant it. Mrs. Miller pressed her hand and said something soft that got swallowed by the wind when they stepped back outside. The clock on Miller's mantel read 10 past 5. They had less than an hour. The depot was 4 blocks south, and the walk was miserable. The cold had teeth now. Evie's lamp guttered twice, and she cupped her free hand around the glass to keep it alive. Garrett walked beside her without speaking, which suited her fine. She didn't have anything to say. She was running on something that wasn't quite courage and wasn't quite fear, but lived somewhere between them. The depot platform was exposed on 3 sides. The wind came across it like something personal. 2 lanterns hung from the overhang and swung hard. A thin porter was huddled near the door to the ticket office, and farther down the platform, under the second lantern, stood Jared Sterling. Evie saw him before Garrett did. Sterling was 50 and prosperous-looking, in a way that sat poorly on him, the way expensive clothes sit poorly on a man whose face has gone mean. He wore a long wool overcoat and good boots. and a hat that cost more than most men in Blackwood Ridge made in a month. He had two men flanking him at a respectful distance. He was watching the far end of the track with his hands behind his back, and when Garrett and Evie came down the platform, he turned and smiled. The smile didn't get anywhere near his eyes. "Thorne," he said, cutting it close. Garrett said nothing. He stopped 10 feet away and held Sterling's gaze. Evie stopped beside him. Sterling looked at her. "Miss Finch, I didn't expect to see you here, Mrs. Thorne," Evie said. Something moved in Sterling's face. A small recalculation. He looked at Garrett. "She's my wife," Garrett said. "Legal and witnessed. You want to see the certificate? You can see it in front of Judge Ross." Sterling's smile thinned. "How convenient," he said. "I wonder how long this particular arrangement will hold up in county court." "As long as it needs to," Garrett said. A sound came down the track. Low at first, then building. The groan and hiss of the morning train coming in from the east, headlamp cutting a pale cone through the falling snow. The platform vibrated slightly under their feet. The porter moved forward. Sterling's men straightened. The train came in slow and breathless, and stopped with a long shudder of brakes and steam. 3 passengers got off. A man with a traveling case. An older woman who was met by someone immediately. And then at the far end of the car, a railroad conductor stepped down first, and then turned and lifted a small figure onto the platform. The child was tiny. That was the first thing. She was so small that the coat she wore too big. Clearly not hers. Some donated thing with the cuffs rolled up 4 times made her look smaller still. Her dark hair was pulled back rough, like someone had done it quick and without kindness. She had a wooden doll hanging from one fist by a single remaining arm. She stood on the platform and looked at the group of adults in front of her the way a cornered animal looks at a room full of people. Garrett took 1 step toward her. She took 1 step back. He stopped. The conductor said something to the porter and handed off a small document. And that was the whole of the official transaction, a piece of paper, and a 7-year-old girl standing alone in the cold at 5:40 in the morning. Garrett tried again, slower this time, hands visible. "Hattie?" he said. "It's your Uncle Garrett." The little girl's face went through something complicated. Her mouth pressed flat, her eyes dark and large and too watchful, for her age, moved from Garrett to Sterling to Evie and back. "You left," she said. Her voice was small, but it had iron in it. "You didn't come." "I know," Garrett said. "I'm sorry. You left me there." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I waited, and you didn't come. And they put me in the room with the other ones. And it smelled bad, and the food was cold, and I waited." She stopped. Her whole body was shaking, and Evie couldn't tell anymore how much of it was cold. Garrett crouched down to her level. "Hattie," she threw the wooden doll. Not at him exactly. Into the slush at the edge of the platform. It hit and bounced once, and lay there with its one arm up. Then she lunged forward and hit Garrett's shoulder with both fists, short, hard blows, and he took them, just took them, until she ran out of something, energy or anger or both, and then she buckled. He caught her. For a second, it seemed like she might let him hold her. For just a second. Then her eyes rolled back and she went completely limp. Evie was already moving. She crossed the platform fast, went to her knees in the slush beside them. She pressed 2 fingers to the child's throat. Pulse was there, thin and quick. She checked her lips, cracked, pale. She pressed the back of her hand to Hattie's forehead. "She's malnourished," Evie said, "and her temperature is dropping. We need to get her inside." Sterling stepped forward. "The child is county property until this situation is assessed by." Evie stood up. She turned around and looked at Jared Sterling with a steadiness she had built over 8 months of staying quiet when she should have spoken and speaking when she couldn't afford to, and she used it all now. "Your court order," she said, "treats an orphan like liquidated property. But right here, on this platform, this child has a mother and a right to be safe." Sterling blinked. "She is not county property," Evie continued. "She is a 7-year-old child who has been inadequately fed, inadequately housed, and sent alone on a train in winter. You want to bring a legal argument against me? You bring it in front of Judge Ross. But you will not stand between me and this child one more second." The two men flanking Sterling looked at each other. Sterling's jaw was tight. He looked at Garrett, who was standing now with Hattie unconscious against his shoulder, his face giving nothing away. He looked at Evie, who was not moving and not blinking. He stepped aside. Evie picked up the wooden doll from the slush. She wiped it on her coat and tucked it into her pocket. Then she walked alongside Garrett as he carried Hattie down the platform toward the street, and she didn't look back at Sterling. Not once. Behind them, the train hissed and shuddered and began its slow pull out of the station. Above the ridge, the sky had gone from black to the deep bruised blue that comes just before morning. Not sunrise yet, but close. They had made it, for now. The road up to the ranch was steep and punishing even in good weather. In December, with 8 inches of new snow and a wind that came down off the ridge like a thrown stone, it was something else entirely. Garrett drove the wagon with Hattie bundled between him and Evie on the bench, wrapped in every blanket they'd managed to pull from the back of the rig. The child had regained consciousness about 20 minutes out of town. She hadn't spoken. She sat with her body pressed against Evie's side and her eyes fixed on the dark tree line ahead, watching it the way a person watches a place they don't trust yet. Evie kept one arm around her shoulders. Steady. No pressure. Just there. Gideon Cole was waiting at the gate. He was a big man, Gideon barrel-chested, maybe 40 years old, with close-cropped gray at his temples and a blacksmith's hands, the kind built by 15 years at a forge. He'd been in Garrett's regiment during the war, quartermaster, 2nd Company. He'd settled in Blackwood Ridge 6 years back, set up a smithy, and had been a quiet, steady presence ever since. He took one look at the wagon coming up the lane, at the child asleep against Evie's arm, and the bloody linen at Garrett's neck, and he fell in beside the rig without asking questions. "Sterling," he said. "Sterling," Garrett confirmed. Gideon nodded and said nothing else. The cabin was solid timber, built low and long against the hillside, like it had grown there. A good fireplace, a root cellar, 2 rooms, and a loft. It smelled of pine pitch and old smoke, and something that might have been dried herbs. Hattie got Hattie inside and onto the cot near the fire, while Garrett and Gideon put up the horses and checked the outbuildings. She found some salt pork and dried beans in the pantry and got a pot going. Simple. Hot. That was what the child needed first. Hattie sat on the cot and watched her. "You're the lady from the store," she said finally. Evie glanced over. "That's right, I was. Are you really his wife?" On paper, Evie kept stirring. "We met last night." Hattie considered this with the seriousness of a judge. "That's fast. It was an emergency because of me?" Evie turned from the fire and looked at the girl directly. Hattie's face was still hollow cheeks too thin, shadows under her eyes too dark, but the fear in it had shifted to something closer to plain curiosity. "Partly," Evie said. "You were part of it. A big part." Hattie pulled her coat tighter. "Sterling said, nobody wanted me." "Sterling is a liar," Evie said. "Clean and simple, no softening. Your uncle has been fighting to get you back since October. That's 3 months of paperwork and legal battles and driving to county offices in the cold. People who don't want somebody don't do that." Hattie looked at the fire. Evie brought her a bowl of broth. It wasn't much, just the liquid off the top of the pot, but it was hot and salty, and she watched Hattie take the first sip and then the second one faster. The men came back inside around noon. Garrett ate standing at the counter. Gideon sat at the table, and they spoke in low voices about the property line, about Sterling's men having been seen on the eastern track 2 nights prior, about a section of fence that had been cut and restrung badly, like someone had gone through it and tried to cover their tracks. Evie listened while she helped Hattie into a dry pair of wool socks she'd found in the trunk at the foot of the cot. "How many men does Sterling run?" she asked. Garrett looked up. "Enough. That's not a number. 5 on payroll that I know of. Could be more if he's hiring out." He set his bowl down. He won't come at us straight. It's not his way. He'll use the law first, and when that fails, he stopped. The sound reached them before he finished the sentence. A low crackling from outside. Then, a brightness at the window that had no business being there at this hour on a winter afternoon. Gideon was up before anyone else. He crossed the window and pulled the curtain and went very still for half a second. "Barn's on fire," he said. Garrett was already at the door. He hit it with his shoulder, and it swung open into a blast of cold air and orange light. The barn was 30 feet from the cabin, and it was burning from the roof down. Dry timber taking the flame, like it was grateful for it. Two shapes were moving in the tree line on the south side of the property. A third was working toward the fence line. Hattie scrambled up from the cot. Evie caught her by the shoulders. "Stay inside," she said. Firm, no argument in it. Hattie's eyes were wide and full of something too old for a 7-year-old's face. "I'll come back," Evie said. "I promise you. Stay behind the door and don't open it for anyone but me or your uncle." She grabbed the Winchester from the rack beside the fireplace, a Model 1873, lever action, 16 rounds if it was loaded full. She checked the magazine. It was. She went out. The cold hit her like a wall. The barn was roaring now, the upper loft fully taken, sparks lifting off the roof in spirals and drifting south. Garrett was already at the barn doors, which had been chained from the outside. She could hear the horses inside, that high, panicked sound that makes the back of your neck go cold. He was working at the chain with his hands, trying to find the weak link, and she could see it wasn't going to come fast enough. Two men broke from the tree line on the east side. One had a rifle up. Evie shouldered the Winchester and fired. Not at the man, at the rifle. The shot took it at the stock, just above his grip. It spun out of his hands, and he grabbed his fingers and went down to one knee. In the snow. The second man stopped moving. He looked at the rifle in the snow, then at the cabin, trying to find where the shot had come from. Evie had already moved. She was up on the fence rail, then up the side of the hayloft ladder, the external one, on the south face that hadn't caught yet. The smoke was thick and moving fast, and her eyes watered, but she kept going until she reached the loft door and braced herself against the frame and looked down at the property. 3 men total. 1 down. 1 stationary, re-evaluating. 1 more working toward the cabin from the west. She levered the Winchester and fired at the ground, 6 inches from the third man's boot. He stopped. She fired again, same spot, and he turned and ran. Below her, Garrett had gotten the chain loose. He threw the barn doors open, and the horses came through fast and wild, hooves throwing snow, and he pressed himself flat against the door frame to let them pass. Gideon appeared from the east side of the barn with a long-handled tool, a fire rake, she thought, and started beating at the base of the flames to cut a line before they could spread to the fence line. The remaining man in the tree line fired twice. Both shots went wide. Evie put a round into the branch directly above his head. Bark exploded. He was gone in under 3 seconds. She climbed down from the loft. Her hands were shaking slightly, from the cold or the adrenaline, or both. She didn't stop moving. She went around to where Garrett was, and he was standing looking at the burning barn. His face lit orange, his expression difficult to read. "Anyone hit?" she asked. "No." He looked at her, looked at the Winchester in her hands. "You always shoot like that?" "Only when I need to." She handed the rifle back to him. They were Sterling's, hired men. Same 2 from the eastern track. He turned back to the fire. It was too far gone for the barn. They both knew it. Gideon was already there, a little breathless, his coat scorched at one sleeve. "Fence line's clear," Gideon said. They didn't get to the house. Garrett put a hand on his shoulder. "Good work, brother." Gideon gave him a short nod. Evie noticed that, the word, the ease of it. No performance, no announcement. Just a man calling another man what he was. She glanced at Gideon's face and found nothing surprised in it. The word had clearly been used before. Quietly, between them. It was the kind of thing that gets established in the field and doesn't need reestablishment later. She turned and looked back at the cabin, a small pale face in the window. One hand pressed flat to the glass. Hattie had watched the whole thing. Evie walked back to the cabin. She opened the door and stepped inside, and Hattie was standing 4 feet away, still in her wool socks, the wooden doll back in her hands. She'd retrieved it from Evie's coat pocket. Both arms were on it. Now she'd found the missing one somewhere and stuck it back on, the repair rough but determined. The girl's chin was up. Her eyes were dry. She'd been scared and she hadn't looked away from it, and she was still standing. That mattered. "Is Uncle Garrett hurt?" she asked. "No," Evie said. "He's not." Hattie looked down at the doll, then back up. "You shot their guns?" "I did. Not the men, just the guns." "That's right." Hattie turned this over for a moment. "Why not the men?" Evie knelt down so they were at the same height. She took a breath. "Because you don't hurt a person more than you have to," she said, "even bad ones. What those men did tonight was wrong and dangerous, but shooting to wound or kill is a last answer, not a first one. You take the weapon. You take away what's hurting people. That's different from taking the person." Hattie looked at the doll. "Sterling took away what I had," she said quietly. "He took my mama's house, and he took me away from Uncle Garrett, and he took my other doll, the good one, when they put me in the poorhouse." Evie looked at her. "I know," she said. "What he did to you was wrong, and we're going to fight it the right way with evidence and law and people telling the truth." She paused. "But we're going to need to be smart and patient and brave. Can you do that?" Hattie thought about it seriously. "I've been being brave since October." "I know," Evie said. "I can tell." The door opened and Garrett came in, cold air trailing behind him. He stopped when he saw them crouched together on the floor. He looked at Hattie. She looked back at him. The standoff from the platform was still there between them, unresolved, but something in it had shifted slightly. He crossed to the fire and held his hands out to it. "Barn's gone," he said. "Horses are in the south paddock. Gideon's watching the perimeter." He was quiet for a moment. "Nobody's riding up this road tonight in a blizzard. We're safe till morning." Hattie sat down on the hearthrug with her doll. Garrett looked at Evie across the firelight. She looked back at him. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge again, hard and low and relentless, and somewhere out in the dark, the last embers of the barn were eating themselves down to ash. But the cabin held. The fire held. The three of them sat in the warmth of it, a scarred rancher, a woman with a borrowed name, and a fierce little girl with a mended doll. And the night pressed up against the windows and found no way in. 3 days after the fire, the mountain sealed itself shut. The snow came down in sheets, then walls, then something beyond walls, a steady, suffocating white that turned the tree line to gray smudge and the paddock fence to a rumor. By the fourth morning, the drifts on the north side of the cabin had climbed to the windowsills. The world outside reduced itself to wind and white, and the occasional creak of the roof under new weight. Inside, they made a life of it. Gideon had brought supplies up from his smithy before the road closed: smoked venison, dried corn, 2 sacks of flour, lamp oil. He'd also brought something Evie hadn't expected: a canvas satchel containing 3 ledger books, a roll of county maps, and a tin box of folded correspondence. He set them on the table without explanation and looked at her with the expression of a man who'd been waiting for someone to hand them to. "Sterling's books," he said, "or copies of them. The county clerk is his cousin, so the originals won't move. But I worked 2 seasons doing inventory for the county surveying office before Sterling found out I could read and had me removed." He paused. "I kept notes." Evie sat down and opened the first ledger. The numbers were there, and they were wrong. Not sloppy wrong, not honest mistake wrong. Deliberately, carefully wrong. Water rights recorded under dummy property names. Acreage reassigned on paper to parcels that didn't exist. Fees collected and disbursed to accounts with no physical address. Whoever had constructed it knew exactly what they were doing and had counted on nobody being able to follow the thread. Gideon could follow numbers well enough to know something was off. But the legal language in the attached correspondence was beyond him, and some of the accounting notation used shorthand he hadn't encountered. Evie had. She'd spent 3 years managing the books for the Chicago Board of Education before she got married, before she became Julian Montgomery's wife and stopped being allowed to work. "All right," she said, and pulled the lamp closer. "Show me what you've found." They spent the better part of that first day at the table together. Gideon pointing to entries, and Evie tracing them forward and back through the ledger columns. Hattie sat nearby, ostensibly playing with her doll, but her eyes kept drifting to the ledger pages. By mid-afternoon, Evie had found the spine of it. A series of transfers, all filed in the same 2-week window 3 years prior, that reassigned water access rights from 6 separate ranch properties, including Blackwood Ranch, to a land management company called Meridian Holdings. Meridian Holdings had no office, no listed agents, and no presence in the territorial charter filings. It was a shell, a name on paper that existed to hold stolen water and sell it back. "Do you know who Meridian Holdings is?" she asked Garrett. He was at the fireplace, adding wood. He didn't look up. "Eastern Money. That's all I've ever been able to find." "Eastern Money with a very specific interest in Montana water rights," she said, "and a very specific relationship with your county commissioner." Garrett said nothing. He set the log and stood. Evie made a note on a clean page and moved on. Hattie drifted to the table that afternoon and sat beside Evie without asking permission. She looked at the pages for a while. Then she pointed at a column of figures. "What's that?" "Numbers," Evie said. "They're supposed to show how much land someone owns and how much water comes with it. But these ones are lying." Hattie frowned. "Numbers can lie. Anything can lie if a person arranges it wrong on purpose." Evie turned to a clean page in her own notebook and wrote a simple column of figures. "See this? What does this add up to?" Hattie looked at it. She moved her lips slightly. "I don't know numbers that high," she said. She said it without embarrassment, which told Evie something important about her. "That's all right," Evie said. "We'll start with the ones you do know." That was how the lessons began. Not formally, not with any announcement. Evie wrote letters in the margin of her notebook, and Hattie copied them carefully with the stub of a pencil Evie found in her coat pocket. Garrett watched from across the room and said nothing, but he watched. By evening, they had a rhythm, Gideon and Evie working the ledgers, Hattie practicing letters near the lamp, Garrett keeping watch from the window, and coming in to eat when called. It was domestic in a way that felt improvised and therefore real. Nobody had planned for it. It had just arranged itself out of necessity and proximity. On the 5th night, the log popped. It was a sharp crack, a knot in the pine, letting go fast as the fire reached it. And it was loud enough that Hattie startled and dropped her pencil. Evie looked up from the ledger. Gideon glanced across the table. And Garrett was gone. Not gone from the room, but gone from himself, which was different and worse. He was standing at the window where he'd been for the last hour, and he hadn't moved in any outward way, but everything in his body had changed. His shoulders were rigid. Both hands were braced against the window frame. White-knuckled. His breathing had gone fast and shallow and audible, and he was staring at something that wasn't the snow-covered dark outside. He was staring at something far behind it, something none of them could see. Gideon made a small movement, like he was going to stand. Evie put her hand on his arm briefly. She shook her head once. She got up from the table and crossed the room. She didn't approach Garrett from behind. She moved to his side, into his peripheral vision, and stopped there. She didn't touch him yet. She just stood where he could see her, if he came back to himself enough to look. "Garrett," she said. "Quiet, even, nothing." Garrett, same tone, not louder, just steadier. His breathing was ragged now, his jaw was clenched. She could see a vein at his temple. "You're in the cabin," she said, "Blackwood Ridge. It's December 1888. The sound was a log. The fire's in the fireplace. You're standing at the window." She kept her voice flat and rhythmic, not soft, not coddling, just factual. an anchor of facts. Hattie is behind us at the table. Gideon's here, I'm here. Nobody is hurt. A long pause. His breathing slowed fractionally. She reached out and put her hand over one of his on the window frame. Not gripping, just covering. Present. Can you feel that? She asked. His hand moved under hers, just slightly. He turned his palm up, and his fingers curled once around hers, and then went still. His breathing kept slowing. After a while, she didn't know how long, time went strange in those moments. He let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep. His shoulders dropped half an inch. He blinked, and the vacancy in his eyes cleared like fog off glass, and he was back. He looked at her hand over his. He looked at her face. Sorry, he said. His voice was rough. Don't be, she said. He stepped back from the window, and she let him. He went to the table and sat down heavily and pressed both hands flat on the surface, looking at them. Hattie was watching him with serious eyes. She didn't look frightened. She looked like she recognized something. Gideon topped up Garrett's coffee cup and set it in front of him and sat back down with his ledger like nothing had occurred, which was exactly the right thing to do. Evie sat back down across from Garrett. She didn't ask if he was all right. He clearly wasn't, in the full sense of the phrase, and they both knew it, and asking would have been for her benefit, not his. The mind collapse, she said instead. Matter of fact. He looked up. You heard about that. People talk. She paused. You were the scout. You led the survey team in. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. I led 17 men into a shaft that had 3 visible stress fractures in the upper beam. I'd seen worse and been wrong before, so I called it safe. He stopped. I was wrong that time, and she said. I was closest to the entrance. His voice was flat. I got out because I was in the right place. Not because I was better, or smarter, or faster. Just because of where I was standing. That's called surviving, Evie said. It's not the same as being responsible. Tell that to the 17. They're not here to tell anything to, she said. You are. It was blunt. She knew it. But soft words had a way of sliding off guilt without touching it, and she'd learned that from experience. She'd spent 2 years being told by Julian's friends that her bruises weren't that bad, her fear wasn't that serious, that she was overreacting. Soft words in service of the wrong thing were a kind of lie. She wouldn't use them. Garrett looked at her across the table for a moment. Your husband, he said. The one in Chicago. She held still. How long? He asked. She knew what he meant. She pulled her left sleeve back. There was a scar on the inside of her forearm, long and old, faded to silver. There were 2 smaller ones above it. She let him see them and then pulled the sleeve back down. 4 years of marriage, she said. The first one was 3 weeks in. I thought it was an accident. She paused. It wasn't. Why didn't you leave sooner? She looked at him directly. Because he was a federal advisory committee member with 3 judges in his pocket and a story about his fragile, unstable wife, already built and ready to deploy. Because I had no money of my own, no family he hadn't gotten to first, and no name that wasn't already attached to his. She paused. I left when I found the right moment, not before. The fire snapped softly. A small snap this time. Nobody flinched. You're braver than me, Garrett said. I'm not. She meant it. I was just running from something immediate. You've been fighting something you can't put your hands on. That's harder. Hattie had gone back to her letters. She was copying them out in a slow, careful row, pressing hard with the pencil stub, her tongue between her teeth. Evie looked at her and felt something clear and purposeful move through her. I want to show you something, she said to Hattie. She took the notebook and turned to a fresh page. She wrote one word in large clear letters, Hattie. That's your name, she said. Hattie looked at it. She looked at the letters individually, then at the whole. That's me, she said. That's you, written down, which means it exists on paper, which means nobody can take it. Evie set the pencil in front of her. Now you write it. Hattie picked up the pencil. She bent over the page. The first attempt was shaky, the H too wide, the T listing. But she finished all 6 letters, and she looked up. And there was something in her face that hadn't been there before. Again, she said. Evie smiled. Again. Gideon watched this from across the table. After a moment, he reached into the canvas satchel and pulled out one of the county maps. He unrolled it carefully and looked at it. Then he looked at Evie. "There's something else in these papers," he said. "A name. Shows up in 3 of the correspondence letters as the guarantor of Meridian Holdings." He pointed to a line of text. "I can't read the cursive script, but I've seen this name on documents before, and it didn't sit right." Evie leaned over and looked at where his finger rested. She read it. Then she read it again. The name was Julian Montgomery. She sat back in her chair. The cabin was very quiet for a moment, except for Hattie's pencil moving on paper and the low voice of the wind outside. Garrett was watching her face. "You know that name," he said. "Yes," she said. She kept her voice level through an act of pure discipline. "That's my husband." The silence stretched. "He's the money behind Sterling," she said. "He's the one buying the water rights. He didn't just want me gone from Chicago." She looked at Garrett. "He followed his money west, and his money is here, on this mountain, trying to take your ranch." Garrett set his coffee cup down carefully. Gideon closed the ledger. Outside, the blizzard pushed against the walls of the cabin, and the windows rattled in their frames, and the fire burned steady and orange, and none of them spoke for a long moment, because there was too much to say, and not enough of it was good. Then Hattie held up her notebook. She had written her name 6 times in a row, each one a little steadier than the last. "Look," she said. "They looked good," Evie said, and she meant that too, in the middle of everything else. "That's very good." The blizzard had a name by the 6th day. The men in town called it the White Death, which was either poetry or prophecy, depending on how you felt about Montana in December. Garrett had seen bad winters. He'd camped in the Bitterroots in January with nothing but a bedroll and a fire the size of a man's hand. But this was different. This was the air itself becoming solid. The thermometer, outside the cabin door, read 30 below, and the mercury was still moving. Nobody was getting up this road. Nobody was getting down it. They were safe, and they were stuck, which were the same thing in different moods. Evie had established something close to a school in the mornings. The table by the window, when the light was good, became Hattie's workspace. They had moved beyond letters into simple words. Hattie was faster than Evie had expected, with the focused, hungry speed of a child who'd been waiting for this without knowing it. "What's this one?" Evie would ask, pointing. "Cat," Hattie would say. "Then I know what a cat is." "Can we do harder ones? You have to walk before you run." "I can already run. Then we walk faster." Garrett watched these exchanges from wherever he was in the room. He'd started sitting closer to the table in the mornings. He said it was because the light was better there, for mending harness leather, and nobody argued with him. On the 7th day, he picked up Hattie's notebook while she was eating and looked at the rows of words inside. He set it back down without comment, but that evening he asked Evie if she had enough paper. "For now," she said. The next morning, there was a fresh sheaf of foolscap on the table, taken from the correspondence folder Gideon had brought up. The backs were blank. Hattie looked at the clean white pages and picked up her pencil without being told. Gideon spent his mornings working through the county maps with Evie, trying to establish a chain of evidence that could stand up in a legitimate court. It was slow work. Sterling had been careful. The fraud was layered, each transaction referencing another that referenced another, and pulling the thread cleanly required patience and precision, and a willingness to go back and start again when the logic broke. "There," Evie said, one morning, pressing her finger to an entry. "This transfer. April. 1,886. It references a deed of trust that's filed under Meridian Holdings, but the signatory is listed as a legal agent of the Montana Territorial Bank." She looked at Gideon. "Does that bank still operate?" "Closed in 87, he said, when the cattle prices dropped. So its records went to the Territorial Archive." She sat back, "Which means they're public record, which means if someone went to Helena and pulled the deed of trust." The agent's name would be on it, Gideon finished. And that connects Montgomery to Meridian directly. And Meridian to Sterling, Evie said. And Sterling to the fraudulent water rights transfers. She paused. It's a full chain. Gideon looked at the map for a moment. Helena's 4 days in good weather. They both looked at the window. The snow was coming sideways. Spring, Evie said. Spring, he agreed. The trap, when it came from inside. On the morning of the 8th day, Evie was at the table with Hattie when she heard horses on the road below. Not one or two, several. She stood and went to the window and looked down the lane, and her stomach went cold. 6 horses in the snow, 4 riders and 2 led animals, moving at a careful pace up the switchback, following the packed trail their own supply runs had made. Earlier in the week, before the White Death closed in, Garrett was already at the window beside her. Sterling, he said. He was right. She could see the long wool overcoat even at this distance, and beside him, on a gray horse with a steady, plodding gait, a man she didn't recognize. Broad-shouldered, methodical in the saddle, dressed in the flat, dark colors of someone who wanted to be taken seriously and not noticed simultaneously. "Who's the man on the gray?" she asked. Garrett said nothing for a moment. "Pinkerton?" Gideon said from behind them. He'd come to the window, too. "I've seen that coat before. They wear them to look like nothing in particular." Evie's hands were very still at her sides. She'd been waiting for this. She'd known it was coming. Known it since October. Really, since the moment she'd bought a train ticket with the last of her money and put a false name on it. You could run from a man like Julian Montgomery for 8 months. But running wasn't the same as being free. "They have a warrant," she said. It wasn't a question. "Probably," Garrett said. "Then they'll show it." He looked at her. "Let them in," she said. "Whatever they have is already written. We need to see it." He held her gaze for a moment, then went to the door. Sterling came in first, which was characteristic. He filled a room with his own self-importance before his body was fully through the door. He looked at the cabin interior, at Hattie, at the table, at Gideon standing by the fireplace, at the ledgers and papers spread across the workspace. And his expression went through several things quickly, before settling on something professionally neutral. The Pinkerton came in behind him. He took off his hat. He was maybe 45, with a long, straight nose and watchful gray eyes, and the particular stillness of someone who'd spent decades reading rooms before walking into them. His name, he said, was Nathaniel Pike. Sterling held up a folded document. "I have a federal warrant," he said, "for the arrest of Evelyn Montgomery, also known as Evelyn Mercer, also known as Nora Finch, on charges of fugitive theft and desertion of marital domicile." The room was quiet. Hattie had put her pencil down. "Theft of what, specifically?" Evie asked. Sterling smiled. "Household goods. Correspondence. $300 in cash from the Montgomery household accounts." "I took $40, she said. "My own wages from before the marriage that he never paid me. And I took one letter, which I took because it documented what he did to me." "That's your version," Sterling said. "It's the documented version." Pike was looking around the room in that careful, cataloging way. His gaze moved over the ledgers on the table, paused on them briefly. "Moved on, Mrs. Montgomery," he said. His voice was even, not unkind exactly, but without warmth, professional. "I have a legal obligation to bring you back to Chicago. I'd rather do this without incident, and I'd rather not go back to a man who broke my arm in 3 places," she said. "So we both want things we're not going to get." Something moved in Pike's expression. It was small, and he shut it down quickly. Sterling stepped forward. "This doesn't have to be complicated, Thorne. Hand over the woman, accept the county's generous terms for a voluntary property transfer, and everyone walks away from this mountain in one piece." "The only transfer happening," Garrett said, "is you and your hired men off my land. I have a federal warrant." "You have a piece of paper," Garrett said. "This is my house. She is my wife. And you are standing in my doorway." Sterling's jaw tightened. He looked at Pike. Pike reached into his coat. Garrett's hand moved toward his hip. "Wait." Evie stepped between them. She looked at Pike directly. You're a legal officer. You know that executing a warrant requires the subject to be identifiable and present. I'm not disputing that I'm here. But a marriage certificate changes the jurisdictional basis of a desertion charge, and you know that too. She paused. So let's not do anything irreversible before we've thought it through. Pike's hand had stopped inside his coat. He looked at her. He was thinking. She could see it. The door, in that moment, swung open behind Sterling, and the blizzard came back. It came back like it had never left, like the 7-day pause had been a breath drawn in, and this was the exhale. The wind slammed the door against the wall, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees in 10 seconds. And the snow came in horizontal and thick, and the lamp on the table guttered and went amber and almost out. Sterling shouted something. His men outside were shouting too, muffled, getting farther away, which meant they were moving the horses to cover. Garrett threw his weight against the door and wrestled it shut. The latch caught. The room went still, in the abrupt, pressurized way of a space that has just been sealed against something enormous. Everyone stood still for a moment, catching their breath. Then Evie heard it, a sound from the back of the cabin, small and quick. Wooden, the back door. She turned around. The back door was swinging in its frame. Open an inch, then 2, then pushed by the wind to 3. The cold pouring through it was immediate and vicious. Hattie's stool was empty. The table had her pencil on it. Her notebook. Her doll was gone. Evie crossed the room in 3 steps and shoved the back door open against the wind and looked out into the white. Nothing. Nothing visible. The snow was absolute zero distance, zero horizon. The world reduced to a white roar that swallowed everything past arm's reach. "Hattie!" she shouted. The wind took the word and killed it. She turned back into the room. Everyone was looking at her. Sterling, Pike, Garrett, Gideon. "She's outside," Evie said. Garrett was at the door before she finished the sentence. She'd heard what Pike had said she'd heard it. From across the room, "We're taking this woman back to Chicago," and Hattie had heard it too. A child who had already lost everything once, who had spent October and November being shuffled between adults, who treated her like paperwork, who had just in the last week started to believe that maybe this time was different. The child had heard those words and understood them in the worst possible way. She'd run. 7 years old, no boots on, into a blizzard at 30 below zero. The back door swung in the wind, rhythmic and terrible, banging against the frame over and over like a clock, counting something down. Garrett grabbed his coat. Then he stopped and looked at the room. Sterling had gone pale. Pike had gone very still, and whatever he'd been calculating before had been completely replaced by something that looked, for the first time, like a human reaction. "We need everyone," Garrett said. It wasn't a request. He looked at Pike. He looked at Sterling. "Legal warrants mean nothing if that child is dead in the snow, so you move now or you live with what you didn't do." Pike was already putting his coat back on. Sterling stood a half-second longer. Then he moved. The door opened. The White Death came in. And one by one they went out into it, enemies and family all at once, and the door swung behind them in the roaring dark. Hattie was gone. The mountain had swallowed her whole. The cold was a living thing out there. It pressed against every exposed inch of skin and worked at the seams of coats and collars and gloves with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. The wind didn't gust. It sustained. A steady, massive force that pushed against them like a wall that kept moving. Garrett went first. He put his head down and pushed into it. Evie followed 2 steps behind. She'd wrapped her scarf twice around her face, leaving only her eyes. The snow was so thick, it was like walking inside a cloud. She could see Garrett's back clearly. 3 feet past him was white nothing. Gideon came behind her. Then Pike. Sterling had stayed at the door. Nobody had time to argue with him about it. "Stay close," Garrett called back. His voice flattened immediately in the wind, lost its distance. "Single line. Don't lose sight of the person ahead." They moved around the east side of the cabin where the back door had been swinging. Garrett crouched down at the threshold. He had a lamp, but it was nearly useless. The light it threw died within 2 feet in the blowing snow. He studied the ground anyway, looking for compression, for the outline of small feet, for any break in the surface drift. Here, he said. He'd found it. A shallow depression already filling in. Then another, small. Spaced close together, the stride of a child moving fast. They went east toward the tree line, angling slightly downhill. Garrett stood and moved. He didn't run. Running in drifts, this deep burned everything fast and got you nowhere. He moved at a controlled, ground-eating pace, checking the trail every few steps, adjusting direction. This was the work he'd done for 4 years as a scout, reading ground, reading terrain, following what the land told him. He'd done it in mud and in summer dust and in Virginia clay. Snow was harder, but the principle was the same. You looked for what had been disturbed, and you followed the disturbance. Evie kept pace. Her legs were soaked to the knee. She couldn't feel her feet anymore, which was something she noted and put aside because there was nothing to be done about it. "How long has she been out here?" Pike said, behind her. He was breathing hard, a city man's breath, short and high. 7 minutes, Garrett said. Maybe 8. Nobody said anything else about that, because everyone understood the arithmetic. The tree line appeared out of the white, like something arriving rather than something they were approaching. The pines were massive up here, old growth, tight together, their branches loaded with snow that the wind dislodged in curtains. The forest broke the worst of the wind. Immediately, inside the tree line, the noise dropped from a roar to a moan, and Evie could see 10 feet instead of 3. Garrett held up his hand, and they stopped. He listened. She listened, too. At first, nothing. Wind in the branches, a creak somewhere above them, the sound of their own breathing. Then, faint and directional, from somewhere south along the tree line and downslope, a high, thin sound. Not a voice, exactly. More like the sound a person makes when they've been crying so long they're out of volume, and what's left is just the shape of it. Garrett moved south. They followed the sound for what felt like a long time. It was probably 4 minutes. The slope steepened, and the trees thinned slightly, and then Garrett stopped and Evie came up beside him and looked. A rock formation. A cluster of granite slabs pushed up through the hillside at angles, creating a natural alcove where 2 of them leaned together. The space inside was maybe 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep, floor packed with old pine needles under a skin of new snow. It was sheltered from the wind just barely. Hattie was in it. She was curled against the back rock with her knees pulled to her chest and her arms wrapped around them, and her face pressed into her own knees. She still had the wooden doll. She'd stuffed it inside her coat somehow, its head poking out at the collar. She had no boots. Her feet were wrapped in 2 layers of wool sock, which were soaked through and gray with cold and packed snow. Around the outside of the rocks, in a loose perimeter that was tightening, were wolves. 5 of them. Timber wolves, big and winter-thin, their coats gray-brown against the snow. They'd found her the way predators find small things in storms, by patience, by following the thermal signature, by the fact that they had nowhere else to be. They weren't charging. They were waiting, which was worse. Wolves knew how to wait. Garrett counted them in one sweep. Evie saw him do it. He handed the lamp back to Gideon. He raised the rifle. The shot was enormous in the confined space of the forest. It went into the ground, 10 feet in front of the nearest wolf, not at it, into the earth between it and the rocks, throwing up snow and debris. The wolf lurched back. The others broke left. Garrett levered the action and fired again. Same method, same purpose. Not at them, between them and her. The message was clear, and wolves understood messages. They scattered, here, then gone. The trees swallowed them. Garrett was already at the rocks, down on one knee in front of Hattie, before the sound of the second shot had finished dying. "Hattie," he said. She raised her head. Her face was streaked and raw, and her lips had gone bluish at the edges. She looked at him, then past him at Pike, who had come up behind. She flinched back against the rock, he said. "They're taking you," she said. Her voice was barely there. I heard him say it. They're taking you back to Chicago, and you'll be gone, and I'll be in the room again. And nobody's taking her anywhere, Garrett said. He said, I know what he said. His voice was low and steady. Look at me. I need you to look at me right now. She looked at him. Evie is here, he said. Right here. She's not going anywhere tonight, and neither are you. I need you to trust that. For the next 20 minutes, while we get you inside. Hattie's eyes went to Evie. He stepped up beside Garrett and crouched in the snow at the entrance to the alcove. She reached in and put her hand on Hattie's face. The child's cheek was ice cold, dangerously cold. I'm here, Evie said simply. Hattie grabbed her hand with both of hers and held on. Garrett lifted the child out of the rocks bodily, pulling her against his chest and wrapping his coat around her as much as it would stretch. Hattie pressed her face into his shoulder and gripped Evie's hand simultaneously and didn't let go of either. Pike stood back. He watched Garrett hold the child, watched Evie wade through the snow to stay close, watched Gideon unwind his own long wool scarf and wrap it around Hattie's feet without being asked. He watched all of it with the expression of a man recalculating something important. The walk back was long. Garrett carried Hattie the whole way and didn't slow. Evie stayed at his shoulder. The wind tried to push them back, and they pushed back harder. When the cabin appeared out of the white, Evie felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding locked since the moment she'd seen the empty stool. Sterling was still at the door. He'd built the fire up, at least. He stepped back when they came through. Garrett took Hattie to the cot by the fire. Gideon got water heating. Evie pulled off the soaked socks and looked at Hattie's feet. The toes were white and waxy on the outside, 2 of each foot. Frostbite, early stage. She'd been in the snow roughly 12 minutes total. They'd been lucky. 10 more minutes, and the conversation would have been different. She worked Hattie's feet between her palms. Slow, steady pressure. Not rubbing damaged the tissue. Just warmth applied and held. Hattie made a sharp sound when the feeling started coming back. I know, Evie said. That means it's working. Across the room, Pike was standing near the door. He'd taken his coat off. He was looking at the floor with his hat in his hands, and he had the posture of a man working up to something. Garrett stood by the fire and looked at him. Out here on the frontier, Garrett said, a child's life is worth more than every check in Chicago. Pike looked up. He didn't argue it. He didn't reach for the professional distance he'd come in with. He just nodded once and looked back at the floor. Sterling said nothing. For the first time since Evie had known of his existence, he simply had nothing to say. Hattie fell asleep 20 minutes later, bundled in every blanket they had, her color slowly returning. The wooden doll was on the cot beside her, one arm up. Outside, the White Death continued its work. Inside, something had shifted between the people in the room, and all of them felt it, and none of them yet had words for it. The lean-to was a quarter-mile up the ridge, set back into a granite shelf where an old trapper had built it, probably 30 years prior, and the mountain had slowly made it its own. It was small. One room, barely, a stone hearth, a plank floor, a supply of split wood under an overhang that had stayed dry. Someone had left 3 tins of beans and a box of salt matches on the shelf above the hearth, which, as Gideon observed, was either good planning or good luck, and either way, it was welcome. They'd made it here before the worst of the new storm front hit. The cabin was too exposed on the north side. The wind had found gaps in the chinking and was working at them. But the lean-to was built into the rock face, and the rock kept most of the cold on the outside where it belonged. Garrett had built the fire. Gideon had banked it, and then stationed himself near the door, with his back to the wall, which was his version of sleeping on watch, perfected over 4 years of war. Sterling sat in the corner, furthest from everyone else, and said very little. He'd been saying very little since the walk back from the rocks. Pike sat near the fire. Hattie was on the plank shelf that served as a bunk, wrapped in everything they'd brought. Her breathing was labored and uneven. She'd started shaking during the walk, up the ridge, hard, deep shivers that she couldn't control, and her face had gone from blue-white to a patchy, unhealthy red. The fever had come on fast. Evie worked through the night. She'd found dried yarrow and some kind of root she was reasonably certain was valerian. In the supply shelf tin, whoever the trapper had been, he'd known as mountain plants. She made a poultice and laid it along Hattie's chest. Changed it every hour. Pressed cool cloths to the child's forehead when the fever spiked, and warm ones when the shivering took over. She kept broth hot at the edge of the hearth and got small amounts into Hattie whenever she surfaced enough to swallow. Garrett sat on the floor beside the bunk. He didn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, Hattie opened her eyes. Fully open, clear, present. She looked at the ceiling of the lean-to for a moment, then turned her head. Garrett was there. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then she pushed herself up slightly and threw her arms around his neck. He went still for half a second, like someone who'd been braced for a blow and received something else entirely. Then his arms came around her carefully, one large hand on her back, and he held on. "Papa," she said into his shoulder, "don't leave me." His eyes closed. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. His voice was rough. "I promise you, I'm not going anywhere." Evie, across the room, looked away to give them the moment. Pike was watching. He was sitting forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands linked loosely in front of him. And he was watching Garrett and Hattie with the face of someone who has just had a door opened in their chest that they thought was permanently sealed. He looked at Evie. She looked back at him. "You should know something," she said quietly. She kept her voice low enough that Sterling, asleep in the corner, stayed asleep. "I have correspondence from Julian." Pike's expression didn't change. He waited. She reached into the inside pocket of her coat. She'd kept the letters there since Chicago, 2 of them, folded small, wrapped in oilcloth. She'd slept with them in her coat for 8 months. She unfolded them now and held them out. He took them, moved closer to the firelight to read. She watched him read. She'd read them so many times she could have recited them word for word. The first was a letter from Julian to his business solicitor in New York, dated February of last year, 3 weeks before she ran. It discussed, in the careful language of a man who knew how to say things without quite saying them, the terms of a life insurance policy taken out on one Evelyn Catherine Montgomery, valued at $40,000, and the question of how a payout might be expedited in the event of an unfortunate accident during winter travel. The second letter was the reply. It referenced, in equally careful language, a specialist in such arrangements. The name in the reply was Nathaniel Pike. Pike read the first letter. He read the second one. He read it again. His jaw tightened. He looked up. "He hired me to find you," he said. His voice was very quiet. "He said you'd stolen from him, that you were emotionally unstable, that he feared for your safety and wanted you brought home." "I know what he told you," Evie said. Pike looked at the letter in his hands. "He didn't want a wife found," he said slowly. "He wanted a beneficiary located." He said it to himself as much as to her, working it out, laying it flat. "He needed to know you were accessible, and then arrange for me to become inaccessible in a different way," Evie said. Pike set the letters on his knee. He looked at the fire. She gave him time with it. She understood that a man who'd built his professional life on a particular set of assumptions about who the criminals were needed a moment when those assumptions rearranged themselves. She didn't rush him. Rushing would have been the wrong instinct. After a while, he reached into his own coat. He took out a folded document. He opened it, the warrant she could see, with its official seal, and Julian's signature as complainant, and held it over the fire. He held it there until it caught. Then he dropped the burning paper onto the hearthstone and watched it go to ash. "My contract was to bring you back to your husband," he said. "I don't work contracts that are covers for murder. That's not a line I'm willing to cross." He paused. "I have a personal code. It's not much, but it's what I've got." He reached out and handed her the 2 letters. She folded them back into the oilcloth and put them in her pocket. "Those letters," she said, "together with the county ledgers. Gideon has been compiling the ones that connect Sterling's land fraud to Montgomery's Meridian holdings. That's a full chain from Julian to Sterling to the water rights theft. It can all be presented to Judge Ross." Pike was quiet for a moment. "Montgomery has connections," he said. "Federal committee seats, friends in the Marshal Service." "I know," she said. "That's why the evidence has to be airtight. No gaps, no ambiguity." She looked at him steadily. "Will you testify to what you've just shown me? The warrant, his instructions to you, the insurance policy?" He looked at the ash on the hearthstone. "If it comes to a court proceeding," he said, "I'll stand up." He said it the way people say things they've already decided, flatly, with finality. "I won't be used to cover up a woman's murder. I won't." Across the room, Garrett was still on the floor beside the bunk. Hattie had gone back to sleep, her breathing even now, her color improved. His hand was resting on the edge of the bunk near her. He'd heard the conversation. He looked at Pike across the room. He didn't say thank you. He gave a single nod instead. Pike returned it. Gideon was awake, too, Evie realized. He'd been awake the whole time, listening from his position by the door. He met her eye and said nothing. But he reached into the canvas satchel he'd carried up the ridge and pulled out the ledger and set it on the floor between them. And Evie understood that meant they'd start again in the morning. The fire burned low and steady. Sterling slept in his corner, unaware that the ground had shifted completely under him while he was unconscious. Sometime before dawn, Hattie's fever broke. Evie pressed her hand to the child's forehead and felt the heat recede like a tide going out. She sat back against the rock wall and let herself breathe for the first time in hours. The lean-to was quiet. 6 people in a small space, 3 of them asleep, 1 on watch, 1 staring at ash on a hearthstone, 1 looking at a ledger. Outside, the storm was still going. But it had dropped from violence to persistence, which was the first sign a Montana blizzard gave before it finished. Evie looked at the ceiling, then at Garrett, who had finally closed his eyes, his hand still on the bunk rail, present even in sleep. She thought about the chain of events that had led to this room. A midnight proposal in a failing lamplight, a child on a freezing platform, a barn burning into the dark, a ledger full of lies, a letter that meant Julian had never wanted a wife at all, just a policy with a name on it. She thought about standing in her dry goods store 8 months ago, tallying numbers that didn't add up, watching the snow come in under the door, waiting for a face she recognized. She hadn't expected the face that came. She hadn't expected any of this. But Hattie was breathing easy on the bunk. The ledger was in reach. The letters were in her pocket. And somewhere in the quiet of the worst winter Montana had seen in 20 years, something that had been broken for a long time was, piece by piece, beginning to hold. The dawn, when it came, was still gray, but it came. Storm broke on a Tuesday. They knew it the moment they woke because the sound changed. 8 days of relentless wind and pressure, and then quiet. Not silence exactly, but the absence of that driving force. That constant grinding against every wall and window. The quiet arrived like something physical. Like a held breath finally let go. Garrett was outside before full light. He stood on the ridge above the lean-to and looked down across the mountain. The snow was pristine and deep, and still, every surface coated in a thick white that turned the whole world into something clean and unfamiliar. The sky above was the particular blue that comes only after extreme weather, deep and sharp-edged and almost painful to look at. Sunlight hit the snow and threw back a brightness that made him squint. It was beautiful in the specific way that Montana could be brutal and beautiful at the same time. He gave himself 10 seconds of it. Then he went back inside. "We moved today," he said. "Sterling's men will know the road is passable by noon." They packed what they had. Gideon took the ledgers. Evie took the letters. Pike, without being asked, helped break down the camp with the efficiency of someone long accustomed to moving fast in difficult conditions. Sterling was quiet and pale and cooperative, in the boneless way of a man who has spent 8 days watching his plan disintegrate and hasn't yet decided what to do about it. Hattie walked on her own. Her feet were sore, and she moved carefully, but she walked. The road down was treacherous deep drifts on the switchbacks, ice underneath, where meltwater had refrozen overnight. They went slow. Garrett broke trail in front, and the rest followed in his tracks. Hattie held Evie's hand and concentrated on her feet and didn't complain once. They were 2/3 of the way down when Gideon, who had the best eyes of any of them, stopped and held up his hand. "East Road," he said. "Movement." Garrett looked. Riders on the eastern approach. 6, maybe 7. Moving with purpose, not caution, which meant they were confident, and that meant they were Sterling's men, and they knew something. "They're going to the ranch house," Garrett said. They moved faster. They came out of the tree line at the lower gate, just in time to see 3 men dismounting at the front of the ranch house, with torches already lit. 2 more were at the barn remnants, which had nothing left to burn, but which they seemed to be checking for survivors. A 7th man sat on horseback at the watching. Garrett stopped cold. 7 against 4. Pike and Sterling didn't count for his side in any calculation he trusted. Then he heard it. Horses from the West Road. A lot of them. He turned. They came out of the morning light in a loose group, 12, 15 riders, some of them pushing wagons. He recognized faces as they got closer. Tom Aldrich from the feed store, who'd brought his 2 adult sons. Clara Hess, the postmistress, who had apparently decided that a rifle was appropriate for the occasion and was carrying one across her saddle. Doc Harlan in his buggy with his bag, because Doc Harlan went everywhere prepared for the aftermath. The Beaumont brothers from the South Pasture Road. The Navarro family, all 4 of them, who had driven their wagon up from the valley. 3 women from the church auxiliary, who had brought food, blankets, and, it turned out, a significant amount of righteous anger. Garrett stood at the gate and stared. "They came," Evie said beside him. He didn't have a response to that immediately. She understood it. She'd spent 8 months in Blackwood Ridge watching this man move quietly through town fixing the widow, McPherson's fence post, without being asked, paying old Hector Ruiz's supply account when Hector had a bad season, checking the schoolroom roof after windstorms when there was no school and no children and no one to notice. He'd done these things without ceremony and without expectation, and the town had noticed anyway. Kindness planted in quiet days becomes something else when the days stop being quiet. Tom Aldrich came to the gate on horseback and looked down at Garrett. "Word got to us before the storm closed the valley road," he said. "Sterling's been maneuvering for this land for 2 years. We should have stood up sooner." He looked at the men at the house with their lit torches. "Tell us what you need." Garrett looked at the torches, at his house, at the people behind Tom Aldrich. "Push them back from the buildings," he said. "Don't shoot unless they shoot first, Gideon." "Already on it," Gideon said. He'd disappeared around the side of the fence line with a canvas sack and the focused look of a man with a specific project in mind. What he produced, 40 minutes later, from the remains of the burned barn's iron hardware, and some materials he'd apparently been accumulating since he packed the supply satchel, was a series of improvised explosive charges, nothing sophisticated, nothing meant to kill, but enough noise and concussion to make 7 mercenaries reconsider the economics of their situation. The first one went off near the eastern gate. The horses panicked. 3 of Sterling's men lost their seats. The torches went into the snow and stayed there. The man at the gate wheeled his horse, and the horse made the decision for him and went east at a dead run. The townspeople pushed forward from the west. Garrett moved through the middle of it. There were 2 minutes of shouting and 1 exchange of fire. Tom Aldrich's eldest took a crease across his forearm. Nothing serious. Doc Harlan was already moving toward him. And then Sterling's men were in retreat, trading the financial appeal of a job against the concrete reality of a unified town on a clear morning. They went. By the time the last rider cleared the eastern tree line, The ranch yard was full of Blackwood Ridge, stamping boots and exhaling visible breath into the cold air and looking around at each other with the particular expression of people who have done something together that they weren't entirely sure they were capable of until they did it. Doc Harlan sat up at the porch to check the forearm wound. Clara Hess handed out coffee from a kettle she'd somehow kept hot in her wagon. The Navarro family began clearing snow from the porch steps without being asked. Hattie stood in the ranch yard and watched all of it. Evie stood beside her. "Why did they come?" Hattie asked. "Because your uncle helped them," Evie said, "over years. Small things." Quietly. She looked down at her. That's what goodness does when it isn't performing. It accumulates, and when you really need it, it shows up. Hattie thought about this carefully. "Like how you teaching me to read is small," she said, "but maybe later I can do something big with it." Evie looked at her. "Exactly like that," she said. Sterling sat in the wagon, under Pike's loose but unmistakable supervision, and watched his operation collapse from a distance. He had the look of a man running numbers in his head that kept coming out wrong. Judge Ross arrived from town at mid-morning in his buggy, summoned by a rider Clara Hess had sent down at first light. He took one look at the assembled situation, at Sterling in the wagon, and Pike standing nearby with the posture of a man who has changed sides and is at peace with it, and he pulled out his notebook. "I'll want everyone at the courthouse," he said. "Tomorrow morning, early." He looked at Garrett. "You'd better have something to show me," he said. Garrett looked at Evie and Gideon. "We do," he said. The courthouse in Blackwood Ridge was not built for crowds. It seated 40, if people were willing to share personal space, which, it turned out, they were. By 8 in the morning, every seat was filled, and the back wall was lined 2 deep, and the hallway outside had its own audience listening through the open door. Half the town had come. Some had ridden in from the valley before dawn. The Navarro family was there, the Beaumont brothers, Clara Hess in the front row, with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on Sterling, like she was calculating something. Sterling sat at the defendant's table with a territorial attorney who'd arrived on the morning coach, looking underprepared for the room he'd walked into. Judge Ross came in at 8 sharp and sat down and looked at the crowd without expression. "This is not a performance," he said. "This is a legal proceeding. Anyone who makes it the former will be removed." He opened his notebook. "We'll begin." Sterling's attorney led with the commissioner's authority, the charter clause, the morality provision regarding property and family stability. He was smooth about it, a city man's argument, well constructed, built on the assumption that the room would defer to legal language if it was delivered with enough confidence. Ross listened. He asked 2 clarifying questions. He wrote something down. Then he looked at Garrett's side of the room. Gideon went first. He carried the ledger books to the front of the room and set them on the table Ross indicated, and he stood in front of them and spoke in the clear, steady voice of a man who's been underestimated by rooms like this one before and is not interested in making the experience comfortable for anyone. He laid out the fraud in sequence: the Meridian Holdings Shell Company, the fraudulent water rights transfers, the dummy property names, the fees to non-existent accounts. He explained each step in plain language, without legal ornamentation, the way a man explains something true that he has thought about for a long time. Sterling's attorney objected twice. Ross overruled both. When Gideon finished, Ross looked at the ledgers for a long moment. Then he looked at Sterling. "Continue," he said to Garrett's side. Pike stood up. He was still wearing the flat dark coat he'd arrived in, but something in how he carried himself had changed. He stated his name and his professional credentials: 15 years with the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, operative license in 7 territories, and then he laid the warrant on Ross's table and explained its origin, who had commissioned it, what Julian Montgomery had said he wanted, and what the letters proved he actually intended. He put the letters on the table beside the warrant. Ross read them. He read them twice. His expression did not change, but the quality of his stillness did. Sterling's attorney tried to challenge the chain of custody on the letters. They were in my client's possession for 8 months, Pike said. Continuous. Unaltered. I can attest to their authenticity on the basis of my professional examination. Noted, Ross said. He looked at Evie. She stood. She had thought about what she wanted to say since the lean-to on the ridge, turning it over in the small hours, while Hattie's fever broke and the fire burned low. She hadn't written it down. Written speeches had a way of belonging to the paper instead of the room. She looked at the crowd, at the faces she recognized, Tom Aldrich and his sons Doc Harlan, Clara Hess, the Navarro family, the women from the church auxiliary, Gideon, Garrett, Hattie in the second row, her notebook in her lap, watching with those careful dark eyes. She looked at Sterling. Then she spoke. This frontier stands strong, she said, because of the dignity of those who rebuild from ruin. When a child is loved, a woman is free, and a worker is literate. No tyrant can ever enslave them. The room was very quiet. Sterling used law like a weapon, she continued. He used it against a child who had no one to argue for her. He used it against a man whose only crime was owning land that someone else wanted. He used it against a community that he thought was too scattered and too poor and too tired to push back. She paused. He was wrong about all three. She looked at Ross. The evidence in front of you connects Jared Sterling to Julian Montgomery through Meridian Holdings, through the fraudulent water rights transfers, and through a conspiracy that reaches from Montana territory to a federal advisory committee in Chicago. This isn't a local dispute about a ranch. This is what power does when it decides that ordinary people don't have the right to what they've built. She kept her voice even. The law was written to prevent exactly this. I'm asking you to use it for exactly that. She sat down. Hattie had been writing in her notebook the whole time, small, careful letters, following the words she could catch. Ross looked at the room for a moment. Then he looked at Sterling. Mr. Sterling, he said, on the basis of the documentary evidence presented, your own correspondence, and the sworn testimony of a licensed law enforcement professional, I find sufficient cause to remand you to territorial custody pending a full fraud investigation. He paused. The morality clause motion against Blackwood Ranch is denied. The water rights transfers executed under Meridian Holdings are suspended pending investigation and presumed fraudulent until demonstrated otherwise. Sterling's attorney started to speak. I'm not finished, Ross said without raising his voice. The attorney sat down. Ross looked at Garrett, then at Evie, then at Hattie in the second row. On the matter of guardianship, he said, the county's prior placement of one Harriet Thorne, minor, into institutional custody is hereby voided. Under frontier emergency law, given the demonstrated commitment of both parties and the circumstances of the original placement, I am granting permanent custody of Harriet Thorne to Garrett and Evelyn Thorne. He paused. Effective now. Hattie looked up from her notebook. She looked at Evie. Evie nodded. The child looked back at her notebook. She wrote something on the page, one word, slow and deliberate and correct. Then she pressed the pencil down and sat very straight and was quiet in the specific way of someone who is managing a great deal of feeling with great care. 2 men from the sheriff's office led Sterling out through the side door. He didn't look at the room as he went. His attorney followed, looking like a man reconsidering his career. Ross closed his notebook. Court is adjourned, he said. The room exhaled. Spring came to Blackwood Ridge like an apology, slow and genuine. The snowpack on the upper ridge held through March and let go in April, running off in thin, bright streams that cut new channels through the lower meadow and made the whole mountain smell like cold water and pine. By May, the south-facing slopes had gone green, actual green, and the wildflowers came in behind the green-yellow first, then white, then a purple that had no name Hattie knew, so she made one up and wrote it in her notebook. She filled 3 notebooks before summer. Evie started the school in March, out of the ranch's main room, with 7 children from the Valley families who could make the ride. By May, she had 14. By June, she had 19 and a waiting list and a genuine problem, which was a good problem to have. And she said so. Gideon solved it. He'd been at the forge since February, in between trips to Helena for the archive documents that built out the legal chain against Montgomery. He built the schoolhouse frame from timber garret, cut over winter, a single long room, with 6 windows on the south wall for light, a proper stone hearth, and benches he'd designed himself so they'd be the right height for children rather than the wrong height for adults. He did it with the care he put into everything that mattered, which meant it was going to stand for 100 years. The documents from Helena had done their work. The Territorial Archive had the deed of trust from the Meridian Holdings transfer, signed by a legal agent who, when confronted with Pike's testimony and the Montgomery correspondence, had produced his own records to save himself. Julian Montgomery's connection to Sterling was now a complete chain documented, witnessed, signed. The territorial prosecutor took the case in April. A federal warrant was issued for Montgomery in May, served at his Chicago office while he was in a committee meeting, which Evie thought was, on balance, the correct setting for it. She didn't feel triumph exactly. She felt something quieter. The relief of a thing that had been wrong for a long time finally being made right, which wasn't excitement. It was more like being able to breathe at full capacity again. Pike had testified in Helena in March. He'd been clean and precise and thorough and had not softened a single detail. Afterward, he'd come back through Blackwood Ridge on his way west. He'd stopped at the ranch. He'd stood in the yard and looked at the new barn Garrett and Gideon had raised in January and the schoolroom going up beside it. He'd taken his hat off. "I want you to know," he said to Evie, "I've spent 15 years in this profession believing I was working for the law." He paused. "I'd like to think the last 6 months brought me closer to actually doing that." She'd shaken his hand. He'd ridden west, and she hadn't seen him since, but she thought of him sometimes. Not with warmth exactly, but with the respect you give someone who made a hard correction and made it all the way. The wedding was on the 14th of June. They held it outside, on the south slope of Blackwood Ridge, where the mountain opened up and the view ran for 40 miles on a clear day. And the wildflowers were at full height. Judge Ross came up from town. He'd trimmed his mustache for the occasion, which seemed to be the maximum formal gesture he was willing to make, and Evie respected it. Gideon stood beside Garrett. He wore a good coat and had his hands behind his back and looked at no one in particular, which was his version of being moved. Clara Hess had organized something that was technically a reception, without anyone explicitly asking her to, which was characteristic. There was food, and someone had brought a fiddle, and the Navarro family had made tamales from a recipe that Mrs. Navarro refused to share, but was generous in the making of. Hattie was the one who carried the wildflowers. She'd picked them herself that morning, before breakfast, going out into the South Meadow with a purpose that she explained to no one. She came back with a bunch of the purple ones, the ones with no name except the one she'd made up, and presented them to Evie with the gravity of someone performing an important official function. Evie took them. The ceremony this time was unhurried. Ross spoke the words the same way he always did, with the same weight, the same measure. But the room, the mountain, the open sky was different. The first ceremony had been 11 minutes in a boarding house parlor under a hurricane lamp with borrowed witnesses and a clock running against them. This one had wildflowers and 40 miles of view and a child standing in the front row, holding a notebook and following along. When Ross said the words that mattered, Garrett looked at Evie. She looked back at him. She thought about the counter in the dry goods store. The kerosene lamp swaying, the door hitting the wall, a bleeding man with gray-green eyes, and 4 strides, and no time for pleasantries, slamming his hand on the counter with a choice that was going to change everything, though neither of them could have known that yet. She thought about Hattie on the platform. blue-lipped, and fierce, a mended doll and iron in her voice, and 3 months of survival already behind her at 7 years old. She thought about everything it had taken to get from that counter to this hillside. Garrett said, "I do," looking at her. She said, "I do," looking at him. Ross signed the certificate for the second time. This one went on the wall, inside the ranch house, in the main room, next to the window where the morning light hit it. After, while the food was being laid out and the fiddle was starting up, Garrett and Evie walked with a Hattie to the edge of the slope where the view opened up. The three of them stood there for a moment, without talking. Below them, the valley was green and bright, and the town was a cluster of rooftops in the distance, and the road up the mountain was a thin line cut into the hillside. The sun was coming up full now, climbing past the ridge behind them, throwing gold across everything. Hattie had her notebook. She'd written something on the front page, Evie noticed. She held it up. The letters were careful and even and correct. Hattie Thorne. Then on the second line, "I am safe." Evie read it. Garrett read it. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Hattie put the notebook under her arm. "Can we go eat now?" she asked. Garrett made a sound that was either a laugh or something adjacent to it. He put his hand on her shoulder. "Yeah," he said, "let's go eat." They walked back toward the gathering, the three of them, on a June morning on Blackwood Ridge, while the new schoolhouse sign dried in the sun, where Gideon had just hung it, planed wood, clean letters, burned in with the blacksmith's iron, the Blackwood School, where every child has the right to be safe and dream. The fiddle struck up something bright, and the sound of it carried across the mountain, out over the meadow, over the purple flowers with no name, out into the clear morning air, where it went as far as sound could go. Her answer before sunrise hadn't just saved a child or protected a ranch. It had healed broken souls, given them the courage to stay, and built a real family, not from blood or legal paper, but from presence, from patience, from two people who looked at each other across a failing lamp and chose, without knowing what it would cost or what it would build, to step into the dark together. The sun was fully up now, and it was warm. If you've made it to the end of this story, then you already know it wasn't really about a marriage certificate. It wasn't about a ranch, or water rights, or a blizzard that tried to swallow a mountain whole. Those were the bones of it. The flesh was something else entirely. It was about a woman who had every reason to keep her head down, and her mouth shut and chose not to. Evelyn Mercer had been running for 8 months. She had a false name, a failing ledger, and a husband in Chicago who had broken her in ways that don't show up on paper. She had built a careful, invisible life, and then a bleeding stranger kicked her door open at midnight and asked her to risk all of it for a child she'd never met. She said yes, not because she had to, not because she was cornered. She said yes, because silence in the face of cruelty is complicity, and she knew that better than anyone. That's the first thing this story teaches us. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision that something else matters more. The second thing is about Hattie, 7 years old, malnourished, alone on a freezing platform at 5:40 in the morning, with nothing but a broken doll and 3 months of survival already behind her. Sterling looked at that child and saw a legal liability, a line item, property to be managed. And Evie looked at the same child and saw a person with a future that hadn't been written yet. The difference between those two ways of seeing that difference is everything. How we see the vulnerable among us determines what kind of community we build, what kind of people we become. The third thing is about Garrett, a man carrying 17 names he could never put down. A man who flinched at the sound of a log in a fireplace because his body remembered what his mind was trying to forget. He didn't get fixed in this story. That's not how trauma works, and this story is honest enough not to pretend otherwise. What he got was someone who stood beside him at the window and said, "You are here, you are not alone, and I'm not leaving." Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. And then there's Gideon. a freed black man in 1888 Montana who taught himself to read numbers so precisely that he could see a fraud hidden inside 3 ledger books, and who stood up in a packed courthouse and laid it out clean, without apology, without hesitation. Sterling had tried to remove him because knowledge was dangerous. Gideon proved him right. Literacy is not a luxury. It is armor. It is the one thing that cannot be confiscated at the door. What this story is really saying, underneath all the snow and gunfire and courtroom speeches, is that family is not a document. It is not a bloodline. It is not a name on a certificate or a clause in a territorial charter. Family is what gets built in the hard moments. It's Evie working Hattie's frozen feet between her palms at 2 in the morning. It's Garrett sitting on a lean-to all night with his hand on the edge of a bunk because he promised he wasn't going anywhere. It's Gideon pulling out a ledger in the dark and setting it on the floor between them because the work wasn't finished and morning was coming, and they were going to be ready for it. You build family by staying, by showing up when it costs you something, by choosing, again and again, to be present for the people who need you, even when the road is closed, even when the storm is at 30 below, even when you're not sure you have anything left to give. If this story moved you, if some part of it felt true to something you've lived or something you've hoped for, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell us which moment stayed with you. And if you're new here, welcome. We tell stories about real people in impossible situations who choose, against all odds, to do the decent thing. There's always another one waiting. Take care of yourselves out there, and take care of each other. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, events, and dialogue are products of the imagination and are not intended to represent any real persons or historical events. The historical setting of 1888 Montana Territory has been used for creative and narrative purposes only.